I know the one thing we did right was the day we started to fight. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on.
I woke up this morning to some very, very annoying, indeed outrageous news. News that made me apoplectic. The news that the NFL has decided to introduce a new policy requiring all players to stand on the field during the national anthem or stay in the locker room where no one will be able to see them not standing for the national anthem. I cannot tell you just how aggravated I am by this decision. Now, let me break it down for you very quickly. First of all, for the NFL itself, or individual team owners, to punish players for not standing during the anthem is not unconstitutional. It's not a violation of the First Amendment for the simple reason that the NFL and the teams that make it up are private entities. They are not government organizations, government institutions, and therefore they are not bound by the Constitution and Bill of Rights. So this move does not in any way violate the First Amendment right to free speech because it's not even definitionally or conceptually possible for a private organization like the NFL to violate the Constitution. The issue of constitutionality is not even really relevant to this issue. However, as I basically learned while working at my last full-time job at the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, the right to free speech transcends the First Amendment. It transcends all law, all statutes, constitutions, all legal instruments of every kind. Because it's not just a legal issue, it's also a larger political and moral issue. And so I think there's a moral right to free speech that applies in society at large, in civil society specifically, beyond the four corners of the First Amendment. And that moral right to free speech does not apply only to governments. It binds all of us in society as a whole. The rules of how that larger moral right to free speech applies do not follow the same patterns and obey the same precedents as First Amendment law. They're a lot more debatable. There obviously isn't any central authority like a Supreme Court that has the last word or the final say on how that moral right to free speech applies, etc. That's an issue that we can all debate together in civil society. However, it does exist. So I think that larger moral right to free speech is being violated by this NFL policy. Why? Because let's cut the crap here. This whole idea that kneeling during the national anthem in order to protest police brutality and racial injustice in general in American society is somehow unpatriotic or desecrates the flag or desecrates the anthem or insults the military, it's just garbage. Absolute nonsense. There's never been any merit whatsoever to any of those criticisms of Colin Kaepernick's protests and the protests of all the NFL football players who followed in his footsteps. First of all, they are kneeling. What in the hell is disrespectful about kneeling? It's a deferential act, a deferential posture by its very nature. Kneeling in front of somebody doesn't disrespect them. It's a sign of respect. It's a way of showing your respect and even your veneration for someone or for something, such as a flag or what have you.
What is thy bidding, my master?
Ego, vos absolvo, ab omnibus, peccatis vestris, nomine Patris.
When I hear people like The View's Meghan McCain talking about how, she can't abide this desecration of the national anthem or of the flag. When I hear former football star and civil rights pioneer Jim Brown saying, I want to support Colin Kaepernick, but I can't go all the way because I'm a patriotic American and I can't desecrate the flag or my anthem. Excuse me? What the hell are you people even thinking? I mean, give me a break. What is disrespectful about kneeling? It's a way of showing respect for something or someone. There's even a fancy word for it, genuflection. This whole idea that kneeling during the anthem is disrespectful is nonsense. It's based on the tradition in American society of standing up during the national anthem, particularly before public functions and sporting events and so on. But that's just that, a tradition. A lot of traditions are arbitrary. Who says standing up while the anthem is playing with your hand over your heart and your hat off, at least if you're a man, is the only way to demonstrate one's support for the country or one's patriotism or what have you? Why is that the only way? Where is it written in the stars that that's the only way to demonstrate your patriotism? To stand up and hold your hand over your heart. Why can't you do it by kneeling? That's especially the case when you consider where Colin Kaepernick got the idea for kneeling in the first place. He got the idea from his friend, fellow NFL football player, and military veteran Nate Boyer, who told him about the practice that exists in the military of soldiers kneeling, taking a knee they call it, in honor of their fallen comrades. Colin Kaepernick heard that story and factored it into his protest. He said, let me stop just sitting on the bench during the anthem and kneel, because it is a way of showing that I'm not trying to disrespect the military while I protest racial injustice in American society. He got the idea from the military itself. So how can people possibly claim that this somehow disrespects the military or the country as a whole? And let's not forget, the national anthem is just that, the national anthem. It's not the military anthem. The Marine Corps at least has its own song, the Marines' hymn. From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, we fight our country's battles on the land as on the sea. They have their own song. I'm not sure if each other branch of the armed forces, the Air Force, the Army, and the Navy have their own songs as well, but I wouldn't be surprised if they do. They deserve to have their own songs. Those are songs that represent the military. The national anthem does not represent the military in particular. It represents the nation, not just the military. Even if you think that taking a knee during the national anthem before sporting events somehow disrespects the anthem and the country as a whole, it makes no sense at all to claim that it somehow disrespects the military in particular. Please, let's get that straight. Okay? To anyone who is offended by these national anthem protests before football games, I'll tell you the same thing that people on your side of the political spectrum usually say to offended college snowflakes and other liberal snowflakes whenever they're offended by some right-winger's offensive or controversial speech, and that right-wing speaker wants to come to campus or what have you. I'll tell you the same advice that you give them. Just ignore it. If you don't like to see football players kneeling during the national anthem, change the channel until the anthem's done. Put on your big boy and big girl pants and just disregard it. That is your right. You have the right to ignore and disregard any speech that you don't like. You don't have the right to try to shut it down. That brings me to my next point. Ever since Colin first started sitting and then kneeling, way back in the late summer of 2016, I remember thinking, I don't know how good an idea this is strategically. I agree completely with the cause he represents, with the message he's trying to send. American society still has a lot of work to do and still has a long way to go in its eternal quest to live up to its ideals fully, its ideals of equality and freedom and justice for all. But I never was convinced that this type of protest was the best way to get that point across. Why? Because of exactly what's happened. It's actually distracted people's attention from the issue of racial injustice in and of itself, and has given opponents of racial reform in the criminal justice system and elsewhere in American society an excuse to divert people's attention from that issue. Instead of talking about police injustice and racial injustice in general, now we're talking about the protest itself, and whether it's unpatriotic, whether it's disrespectful to the country, whether it desecrates the flag, the anthem, the military, or what have you. I'm sure that's not what Colin Kaepernick was hoping to accomplish by engaging in this protest in the first place. So I think that on a strategic level, this protest really just played into the hands of opponents of the cause of racial justice in America. But with that said, now that the NFL has seemingly caved into the pressure from a lot of disaffected football fans as well as Donald Trump himself and implemented this censorious policy, now I think Colin Kaepernick, well, not so much Colin himself since he hasn't been playing lately, but all the football players who've been participating in these protests, who've been following in Colin Kaepernick's footsteps, the right thing for them to do now is to turn up the heat. Instead of backing down, instead of cowering in fear, they need to stand up. Not literally, mind you, but figuratively. Stand up figuratively by taking a knee literally. I think this is a question of honor as much as anything else. National honor. All of CK's followers need to continue following in his footsteps and stand up to this retrograde, regressive policy that the NFL has just adopted and protest it by continuing to take a knee during the anthem. Apparently, the way the penalties have been structured, the individual players won't be fined for doing it, rather the teams will be fined. Let them keep kneeling during the anthem and we'll see which team owners have the balls to punish these men for standing up, or rather kneeling, standing up and kneeling at the same time for what they believe in. Remember, when Muhammad Ali refused to be drafted into the U.S. Army to go fight in the Vietnam War in the 1960s, he was stripped of his title and not allowed to box in the United States for the next several years. He was also convicted of breaking the law and appealed the decision, and the case went all the way up to the Supreme Court before he was ultimately vindicated.
When Ali made his statement that he was not going to be a party to an unjust war against the Viet Cong, it was a backlash from the white community. Some of them would call him all times of night, threaten to bomb up his house. They'll throw rocks at his house. Some even drive by in cars, hollering and drunk and shooting at his places and different things like that.
Mr. Muhammad Ali is from Louisville, Kentucky. Do you know what's happening in Louisville, Kentucky today? Marching for open house. They're marching for open occupancy. Now here's a black man who can't live where he wants to live in Kentucky, and the hunkies gonna send him to Vietnam to fight for freedom.
At the 1968 Olympic Games in Mexico City, when Tommy Smith and John Carlos raised the Black Power salute during the playing of the U.S. national anthem during their medal ceremony, they were banned from the Olympic Village and expelled from the Games.
They were booed by the Americans who were down there in Mexico. Then when they got home, of course, there was a tremendous reaction. Death threats came rolling in. I was fired from my teaching position at San Jose State.
Do you think you represented all black athletes in doing this?
I can say I represented Black America.
Ali was sentenced to 5 years in prison. He appealed the decision. For many, Ali remained a popular figure, but his struggle cost him the heavyweight title. Until the courts made a decision, he was effectively banned from boxing.
All these athletes received death threats and public criticism in the public eye in the media after they made their stands. But they still stood up for what was right. So is Colin Kaepernick. So, CK, although I always thought that as a practical and strategic matter, your protest was questionable, in principle, I agree with it completely. I always have, I always will, and I hope that you'll continue to show leadership on this issue off the field like you've been doing for quite some time now. And I hope that all those football players who are still on the field will continue to stand up, figuratively, by kneeling, literally, and continue to fight the good fight against racial injustice and inequality in American society. Don't let Roger Goodell or, God forbid, Donald Jackass Trump stop you from doing the right thing.
You'll never see me stand up and tell this national anthem represents me.
Right on.
Right now, it doesn't matter.
Oh,